April 21st, 1945. Schwarzwald, Germany. The morning fog hung heavy between the towering pines of the Black Forest as Staff Sergeant Thomas Grayson of the United States Army's 28th Infantry Division led his squad through the outskirts of a small village. The men moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles, believing this isolated hamlet had been abandoned like so many others as the Allied forces pushed eastward in the final weeks of the European conflict. "Should be a simple sweep," Grayson whispered to his men, confident that this remote forest settlement would yield nothing more than empty homes and perhaps some useful intelligence documents. Little did he know that within 24 hours, his actions in this forgotten corner of Germany would trigger a chain of events that would save hundreds of lives and reveal the profound humanity that can emerge even in war's darkest hours. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What follows is an account of how a single act of compassion, amid the ruins of the most devastating conflict in human history, would not only save a child's life, but would lead to an extraordinary moment of surrender that military historians still study today. A moment when the overwhelming force of kindness proved more powerful than the most sophisticated weapons of war. The village of Waldenhof had once been a picturesque tourist destination, nestled in the Black Forest, known for its skilled clockmakers and charming timber-framed houses. Now, in the waning days of the conflict, it stood eerily silent, with only the occasional creak of a shutter in the spring breeze disrupting the unnatural quiet. Most civilians had fled eastward weeks earlier, as American forces advanced, and the remaining German military units had reportedly retreated to more defensible positions. "Cooper, Williams, take the north side. Martinez and Johnson south. Reynolds, you're with me down the center," Grayson ordered, his voice carrying the weight of 4 years of combat experience. At 28 years old, Thomas Grayson had risen quickly through the ranks after distinguishing himself during operations in France. Originally from Cheyenne, Wyoming, the former history teacher had a reputation for level-headedness that had kept his men alive through some of the conflict's most brutal encounters. Private First Class Michael Reynolds nodded, gripping his rifle as he followed his sergeant down the village's main street. Reynolds was the newest member of the squad, having joined only 3 months earlier as a replacement. Just 19 years old and from Boston, Massachusetts, he still possessed an optimism that most veterans had long since lost. "You think we'll be home by summer, Sarge?" Reynolds asked, his eyes scanning the windows of the abandoned shops. Grayson adjusted his helmet. "Focus on the job, Reynolds. One day at a time." The official military intelligence had indicated that German forces in this region were disintegrating rapidly, with entire units surrendering or deserting daily. The Third Army had captured over 15,000 prisoners in the past week alone, and intelligence officers estimated that German military cohesion would completely collapse within 14 to 21 days. Yet Grayson had learned that official reports often failed to capture the reality on the ground. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, their battalion commander, had briefed them the previous evening. "Gentlemen, we're dealing with a fragmented enemy. Some units are surrendering en masse, while others, particularly those with ideological leadership, are fighting with renewed desperation. Exercise extreme caution, especially around the mountain villages where communication is limited." As they moved deeper into the village, Grayson noted the signs of hasty departure. Doors left ajar, personal belongings scattered, a child's doll abandoned in the street. These were the universal symbols of civilian flight that he had seen from Normandy to the Ardennes. "Building clear," came Cooper's voice through the radio. "South side clear too, Sarge," reported Martinez moments later. The systematic sweep continued for nearly 2 hours as the squad checked each structure, finding nothing but abandoned homes and shops. The spring sun had burned away the morning fog, and Grayson was beginning to think they would complete their mission without incident when Reynolds called out from an alleyway between 2 damaged buildings. "Sergeant, you need to see this." Grayson found Reynolds standing before what appeared to be the collapsed rear section of a bakery. The building had likely been damaged during an earlier Allied bombing run, targeting a railway junction several miles away. "I heard something, Sarge, like a whimper or a cry," Reynolds explained, pointing toward the rubble. Grayson listened intently, years of battlefield experience having taught him to trust the senses of his men. After several seconds of silence, he heard it too, a faint sound that could only be human. "Could be a trap," Grayson said quietly, signaling for the rest of the squad to establish a perimeter. The German forces had been known to use civilians, even children, as bait in the earlier stages of the conflict. Corporal Diego Martinez, the squad's experienced scout from San Antonio, Texas, approached cautiously. "Want me to check it out, Sarge?" "No, I've got this one," Grayson replied, handing his rifle to Reynolds. "Cover me." Grayson approached the collapsed structure slowly, calling out in the basic German phrases he had learned. "Hello? Ist jemand da? Is anyone there?" The whimpering grew louder, followed by what sounded like a child's voice. Grayson began carefully moving aside pieces of debris, mindful of potentially unstable sections. After removing several wooden beams and broken furniture, he uncovered a small cavity in the rubble and found himself looking into the terrified eyes of a boy no more than 7 or 8 years old. The child was filthy, his face streaked with dust and tears, clothes torn and smudged with soot. He appeared physically unharmed but was clearly in shock, trembling uncontrollably as he stared up at the American soldier. "Es ist in Ordnung." "It's okay," Grayson said softly, extending his hand slowly. "Wir werden dir helfen." "We'll help you." The boy shrank back, his eyes wide with fear. Grayson remembered the chocolate bar in his pocket, part of his rations that he had been saving. He unwrapped it and offered a piece to the child. "Schokolade." "Für dich. For you," he said with a gentle smile. The gesture seemed to break through the boy's terror. After a moment's hesitation, he reached out with a trembling hand and took the chocolate. As he ate, Grayson continued clearing debris, eventually creating an opening large enough to lift the child out. When Grayson finally extracted him from the rubble, the squad gathered around, their expressions softening at the sight of the frightened boy. Sergeant Grayson performed a quick medical assessment. The child was dehydrated and exhausted, but had no serious injuries beyond some minor cuts and bruises. "What's your name?" Grayson asked, using hand gestures to communicate his question. "Klaus," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse. "Klaus Weber." Private Reynolds offered his canteen, which the boy accepted eagerly, drinking the water in desperate gulps. "Easy there, buddy," Reynolds said with a smile. "Not too fast." Martinez approached with their field medic kit. "Let me clean those cuts, Sarge. Don't want them getting infected." As Martinez tended to the boy's minor injuries, Grayson contacted Lieutenant Anderson via radio to report their discovery. One civilian child recovered, approximately 7 years of age, no serious injuries. Requesting guidance, over. Lieutenant Anderson's response crackled through after a brief pause. "Bring the child back to base camp. We'll have our German interpreter question him and try to locate any family members. Out." Grayson turned back to Klaus, who was now allowing Martinez to clean a cut on his arm, though his eyes remained fixed on Grayson, seemingly identifying him as his protector. "How long do you think he was trapped there?" Reynolds asked quietly. "Hard to say," Grayson replied. "This damage looks at least 5 days old, judging by the dust settlement. Kid's tough to have survived this long." While Martinez completed his first aid, Grayson explored the collapsed building further, looking for clues about the boy's family or circumstances. In what remained of the bakery's living quarters, he found a family photograph in a cracked frame, a man and woman with the boy and an older girl, all smiling in happier times. Grayson carefully removed the photo and pocketed it. He also discovered a small wooden toy soldier, remarkably intact among the destruction. When he returned to Klaus and presented the toy, the child's face lit up with recognition, and he clutched it tightly to his chest. "Danke," Klaus whispered, the first hint of trust appearing in his eyes. By late afternoon, the squad had completed their sweep of the village and prepared to return to their base camp with the child. Since Klaus was too weak to walk the 5 miles back to camp, Grayson hoisted the boy onto his shoulders. "You comfortable up there, Klaus?" he asked, receiving a small nod in response. As they departed the village, Grayson noticed the boy looking back at his home with an expression that seemed far too mature for a child his age, a mixture of loss, resignation, and uncertainty that Grayson had seen on too many faces across Europe. The journey back to camp was uneventful, though Klaus remained largely silent, responding only to direct questions with single words or nods. Occasionally, he would point to various forest animals or plants, testing the few German words Grayson knew. Eichhörnchen, Klaus said, pointing to a squirrel darting up a tree. Squirrel, Grayson replied with a smile, establishing their simple language exchange. By the time they reached the American camp, a collection of tents and vehicles established on the grounds of a former school, Klaus had relaxed enough to maintain a grip on Grayson's helmet rather than his shoulders, a small but significant sign of growing comfort. The camp bustled with activity, as soldiers maintained vehicles, cleaned weapons, and prepared for the next day's operations. Several turned to look at the unusual sight of a squad returning with a German child. Captain Robert Miller, the company commander, approached as they entered the camp perimeter. "This the civilian your radio operator mentioned?" "Yes, sir," Grayson replied, lifting Klaus down from his shoulders. "Found him trapped in a collapsed building. No sign of family or other civilians in the village." Miller studied the child thoughtfully. "Get him to medical, then bring him to the command tent. We have a new intelligence officer who speaks fluent German." 20 minutes later, after Klaus had been examined by the company medic and given a clean bill of health aside from minor dehydration and exhaustion, Grayson led the boy to the command tent. Inside, they found Captain Miller speaking with a woman in an army uniform, First Lieutenant Emma Schneider, recently assigned to their unit as an intelligence officer. Lieutenant Schneider, the daughter of German immigrants to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had joined the Women's Army Corps in 1943 and had been serving as a translator and intelligence analyst. Her linguistic skills and cultural understanding had proven invaluable as Allied forces pushed into Germany. "Lieutenant Schneider, this is Sergeant Grayson and the boy his squad recovered," Captain Miller introduced them. Schneider smiled warmly at Klaus and addressed him in perfect German. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, and he responded hesitantly at first, then with increasing animation as the conversation continued. After several minutes, Schneider turned to Grayson and Miller. "His name is Klaus Weber. He's 8 years old. His father is, or was, a clockmaker in the village. When the evacuation orders came, his mother and sister left with most of the other civilians, heading toward relatives in the east. His father stayed behind to protect their shop and home." "Where is the father now?" Miller asked. Schneider's expression grew solemn. "Klaus says they were together when the bombing happened 5 days ago. His father had gone to check on a neighbor's property and told Klaus to wait in the bakery. That's when the building collapsed. He's been trapped there ever since, surviving on some bread and rainwater that collected in the rubble." "And he has no idea what happened to his father?" Grayson asked. "No," Schneider replied. "He's been calling out for him whenever he heard noises, hoping to be rescued." Captain Miller considered this information. "We'll need to file a report and contact civilian affairs. In the meantime, he'll need to stay here until we can arrange proper care." "Sir," Grayson interjected, "with your permission, I'd like to take responsibility for him while he's in camp." Miller raised an eyebrow. "Any particular reason, Sergeant?" Grayson hesitated. "Just seems right, sir. He's already somewhat comfortable with me, and I've had experience with children. I was a teacher before the war." After a moment's consideration, Miller nodded. "Very well. He's your responsibility until further notice. Lieutenant Schneider, please inform the boy of the arrangement." When Schneider explained to Klaus that he would be staying with Sergeant Grayson, the boy looked up at the American soldier with a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. Grayson smiled reassuringly and offered his hand, which Klaus took after only a brief hesitation. That evening, Grayson's squad made Klaus as comfortable as possible in their tent. Private Cooper, who had 3 younger siblings back home in Georgia, fashioned a decent bed from spare blankets. Martinez shared his dessert ration, canned peaches that brought the first genuine smile to the boy's face. After Klaus had eaten, Lieutenant Schneider visited to check on him and brought a notepad with simple English words and their German equivalents, suggesting that teaching him some basic phrases might help pass the time and ease his adjustment. As the camp settled for the night, Grayson sat beside Klaus's makeshift bed. The boy was fighting to keep his eyes open, exhaustion finally overwhelming his fear. "You're safe now," Grayson said softly, though he knew Klaus couldn't understand the words. "Get some sleep." Klaus mumbled something in German before his eyes finally closed. Grayson looked questioningly at Reynolds, who had been learning German phrases from Lieutenant Schneider. "I think he asked about his father," Reynolds whispered, "whether we would find him." Grayson nodded grimly. Based on the damage to the village and the time elapsed, he held little hope for the man's survival, but he wouldn't share that assessment with Klaus. After ensuring the boy was asleep, Grayson stepped outside the tent, where he found Lieutenant Schneider waiting. "How is he?" she asked. "Finally asleep," Grayson replied. "It's a miracle he survived this long." Schneider nodded. "Children are remarkably resilient, but he'll need more than physical care in the coming days." "Meaning?" "He's lost everything familiar, Sergeant. His home, possibly his father, and he's now surrounded by soldiers who, until very recently, were considered the enemy. The trauma of that cannot be underestimated." Grayson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What do you suggest?" "Consistency, routine, a sense of security," Schneider replied. "And patience. Lots of patience." "I can manage that," Grayson said, glancing back toward the tent. "Reminds me of some of my students back home, the ones who'd seen too much too young." Schneider studied him curiously. "You were a teacher?" "High school history," Grayson confirmed with a faint smile. "Seems like another lifetime now." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Miller, who motioned for Grayson to join him a few paces away. "Just received updated orders, Sergeant. Division wants us to push forward tomorrow, establish positions closer to the mountain passes. Intelligence suggests there may be holdout units in the higher elevations." Grayson frowned. "What about the boy, sir?" "He'll need to be transferred to the Civilian Affairs Unit when they arrive the day after tomorrow," Miller replied. "Until then, he remains your responsibility." "Understood, sir," Grayson acknowledged, though he felt a surprising reluctance at the thought of handing Klaus over to strangers so soon. As Miller departed, Schneider approached again. "I couldn't help overhearing. If you'd like, I could watch over the boy tomorrow while your squad is out." "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," Grayson said gratefully. "I'll explain things to him in the morning." The next day dawned clear and cool, with spring making its presence felt in the budding trees surrounding the camp. Klaus woke early, momentarily disoriented before recognizing Sergeant Grayson nearby, preparing his equipment for the day's mission. With Lieutenant Schneider's help, Grayson explained to Klaus that he needed to leave for the day but would return by evening, and that Klaus would stay with the lieutenant. The boy's expression fell, but he nodded in understanding. "Ich warte hier," Klaus said solemnly. "I will wait here." Before departing with his squad, Grayson knelt beside Klaus and pulled out a spare unit patch from his pocket, the keystone insignia of the 28th Infantry Division. "Hold on to this for me," he said, placing it in the boy's small hand. "I'll be back for it later," Lieutenant Schneider translated, and Klaus clutched the patch tightly, nodding with newfound determination. Grayson's squad departed at 0800 hours, joining a larger reconnaissance force moving toward the mountain passes several miles northeast of their position. The objective was to scout potential German defensive positions and assess enemy strength in the area. Throughout the morning, the American forces encountered only minimal resistance, occasional sniper fire, and one briefly contested roadblock that was quickly abandoned. By early afternoon, they had reached the foothills and established observation points overlooking the winding mountain roads. "Seems too quiet," Martinez commented as he scanned the terrain through binoculars. "Intelligence said there should be at least a company-sized unit in this sector." "Maybe they pulled back further into the mountains," suggested Cooper, adjusting his position behind a fallen tree trunk. Grayson studied the map provided by intelligence officers. "Or maybe they've shifted to these alternative routes." He pointed to several narrow passes not marked as primary thoroughfares. "And we should check those before reporting back." As the squad prepared to move toward these secondary routes, their radio operator received an urgent message from base camp. Grayson took the handset, listening intently before his expression changed to one of disbelief. "Say again, base," he requested, certain he had misheard. The message repeated, "All units return to base immediately. Repeat, All units return to base. We have unexpected contact situation requiring full company presence. Grayson acknowledged the order and gathered his men. We're pulling back to camp. Something's happening that they need everyone for. Trouble? Reynolds asked, concern evident in his voice. They didn't specify, Grayson replied, already leading the way back down the slope. But the order came from Captain Miller himself. The return journey was executed with greater urgency than their morning advance. Despite the recall order's lack of details, years of combat had conditioned the men to prepare for the worst, perhaps a surprise counterattack or discovered enemy reinforcements. What Grayson couldn't possibly anticipate was the scene that awaited them upon their return to base camp 3 hours later. As the reconnaissance units approached the camp perimeter, they noticed an unusual formation of vehicles and personnel. Captain Miller, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, and several other officers stood in a semicircle near the command tent. Across from them, under guard but without restraints, stood approximately 15 German soldiers in various states of uniform completion. And at the center of this extraordinary gathering, speaking with Lieutenant Schneider, was a tall man in the uniform of a German Wehrmacht major, a white flag planted in the ground beside him. Most surprising of all was the small figure standing between Lieutenant Schneider and the German officer, Klaus, looking up at the tall officer with an expression of astonished joy, his hand firmly grasped in the man's larger one. As Grayson's squad approached, Klaus spotted him and broke free, running toward the American sergeant with excitement. Mein Vater ist hier," he called out, pointing back at the German officer. Grayson knelt down as Klaus reached him, looking from the boy to the German major, and back again with growing comprehension. "Your father?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the resemblance between them, the same determined set of the jaw, the identical blue eyes. Lieutenant Schneider had followed Klaus and now stood beside Grayson. "Sergeant, may I introduce Major Friedrich Weber of the 336th Mountain Infantry Regiment. He arrived at our perimeter approximately 2 hours ago with his executive officer and 13 enlisted men, requesting formal surrender of his entire unit." Grayson rose slowly, still processing this unexpected development. "His entire unit?" "Yes," Schneider confirmed. "Apparently, there are 378 more soldiers, 2 artillery batteries, and various support personnel waiting at a designated assembly point 5 kilometers from here, all prepared to surrender." Captain Miller approached, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and cautious disbelief. "Sergeant Grayson, it appears you facilitated the largest voluntary surrender we've seen in this sector. Major Weber came looking specifically for the American unit that rescued his son." The German officer, who had been observing this exchange, now stepped forward. With Lieutenant Schneider translating, he addressed Grayson directly. "Sergeant, I am in your debt," Major Weber began, his bearing formal despite the circumstances. "When the bombing separated me from my son, I spent days searching through the ruins. I found evidence he had been rescued by American forces and tracked your unit here." Weber's composed exterior briefly cracked as he glanced down at his son. "I had given orders to my men to fight to the last man, believing that surrender meant abandoning everything I held dear. When I discovered that my enemies had saved my child, when I could not." He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. "I realized then that I had been fighting for the wrong reasons, following orders that no longer served any purpose but prolonging suffering. My men have families too, sons, daughters who need them alive, not sacrificed in a conflict that is already lost." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stepped forward. "Major Weber has provided us with detailed information about remaining German forces in this region and has agreed to assist in facilitating additional surrenders where possible." Grayson looked down at Klaus, who was now standing between him and his father, a bridge between opposing sides. The boy reached into his pocket and solemnly handed Grayson back the division patch he had been safekeeping. "Danke," Klaus said simply, then added with careful pronunciation, "Thank you." Major Weber placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I have been a soldier for 20 years, Sergeant Grayson. I believed I understood honor, duty, loyalty, but it took an American sergeant showing compassion to my son to teach me the true meaning of those values." As the formal surrender proceedings continued into the evening, with Lieutenant Schneider and other officers processing the details and arranging for the larger surrender to be completed the following day, Grayson found himself sitting with Klaus and Major Weber near the edge of the camp. Despite the language barrier, with Klaus and occasionally Lieutenant Schneider translating, the two soldiers found common ground in their shared experiences, not of combat, but of life before the war. Weber had been a reserve officer who ran his family's clockmaking business. Grayson shared stories of his teaching days and his hope to return to the classroom. As twilight settled over the camp, Klaus finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep against his father's side. Major Weber looked down at his sleeping son, then across at the American sergeant who had saved him. "Tomorrow, I will lead your officers to my men, and the surrender will be completed," Weber said quietly through Schneider's translation. "After that, I do not know what comes next for us." "The war is nearly over," Grayson replied. "You've made the right choice for your men and your son." Weber nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps one day, when this is all behind us, our countries will find a way forward as we have, through the simple recognition of our common humanity." As darkness fell over the camp, Sergeant Thomas Grayson contemplated the extraordinary chain of events set in motion by a single act of kindness amid the ruins. In saving one child, he had inadvertently saved hundreds of lives on both sides, creating the possibility for reconciliation where before there had been only the certainty of continued conflict. The following morning dawned with an air of cautious optimism that had been absent from the American camp for months. April 22nd, 1945, a date that would remain engraved in the memories of all present as the day when compassion yielded unexpected fruit. Staff Sergeant Thomas Grayson rose early, having slept little during the night. The significance of what was unfolding weighed heavily on his mind. Outside his tent, the camp buzzed with preparations. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had radioed division headquarters, and additional military police units were en route to assist with processing what would be the largest single surrender in their sector since the Allied push into Germany began. Major Friedrich Weber and his executive officer, Captain Ernst Lehmann, were already awake, reviewing maps with American intelligence officers, marking the locations of their scattered units and identifying potential resistance points that might complicate the broader surrender operation. Klaus remained asleep in the medical tent where he and his father had spent the night under loose guard, a formality that seemed increasingly unnecessary as the morning progressed. The boy had been thoroughly exhausted by the emotional reunion with his father and the confusing flurry of activity that followed. Grayson found Lieutenant Schneider reviewing documents near the command tent, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Good morning, Lieutenant," he greeted her. She looked up with tired eyes that suggested she, too, had had little rest. "Sergeant Grayson, I was hoping to find you. Major Weber asked to speak with you before the operation begins." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Did he say what about—" "No, but he seemed reflective. Perhaps he simply wishes to express his gratitude again." Grayson nodded and made his way to the medical tent. Inside, he found Major Weber sitting beside his sleeping son, gently stroking the boy's hair. The German officer looked up as Grayson entered, and though no words were exchanged, a moment of understanding passed between them, two men from opposing sides united by their recognition of what truly mattered. Weber carefully rose so as not to disturb his son and stepped outside with Grayson. Lieutenant Schneider joined them moments later to translate. "Sergeant Grayson," Weber began formally, "before we proceed with today's events, there is something I wish you to understand." Grayson nodded for him to continue. "My decision to surrender was not made lightly, nor was it made solely because of my son, though his rescue was the catalyst." Weber's eyes held Grayson's steadily. "For months, I have watched as good men died for a cause that had become increasingly difficult to justify. I have received orders that troubled my conscience and seen civilians suffer needlessly." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "In recent weeks, communications from High Command have grown contradictory and fragmented. We receive orders to hold positions at all costs, then counter-orders to fall back, then accusations of cowardice when we comply. The chain of command is disintegrating." Lieutenant Schneider translated carefully. capturing not just Weber's words, but the weight behind them. Yesterday, when I learned that American soldiers had saved my son, had shown him kindness when they could have simply ignored his plight, it crystallized what I had already been contemplating. This conflict must end, and it falls to men like us on both sides to find the courage to end it. Grayson listened intently, recognizing the courage it took for a career officer to make such an admission. "My men trust me," Weber continued. "They will follow my lead in this surrender. But they are afraid, Sergeant, not of capture itself, but of what comes after. They have heard rumors." "They will be treated according to international conventions," Grayson assured him. "They're surrendering voluntarily, and that will be noted in all official documentation." Weber nodded gratefully. "There is one more thing. Among my men are several very young soldiers, boys of 17 and 18 drafted in the final months. They deserve a chance at a future beyond this conflict. I'll personally ensure that Colonel Harrison is aware of their situation," Grayson promised. As they concluded their conversation, Captain Miller approached, informing them that the convoy was ready to depart for the designated surrender point. Weber would travel in the lead vehicle with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and Lieutenant Schneider, while Klaus would remain at camp under the care of the medical staff. When Weber knelt to explain this to his now awake son, Klaus became distressed, clinging to his father and speaking rapidly in German. "He's afraid you won't come back," Schneider translated softly for Grayson. Without hesitation, Grayson knelt beside them. "Lieutenant, could you tell him that I'll stay here with him, that I'll make sure his father returns safely?" When Schneider translated this offer, Klaus looked at Grayson with questioning eyes, then back to his father, who nodded reassuringly. "Ich vertraue ihm," Weber told his son. "I trust him." After a moment's consideration, Klaus reluctantly released his grip on his father's uniform and stepped closer to Grayson, his small hand finding the American sergeant's. Captain Miller raised an eyebrow at Grayson. "Are you certain, Sergeant? Your squad was scheduled to join the security detail." "Reynolds can lead the squad, sir," Grayson replied. "With your permission, I believe I can be of more use here." Miller considered this, then nodded. "Very well. Report to me when we return." As the convoy prepared to depart, Weber paused for one last look at his son standing beside Sergeant Grayson, an image that embodied both the tragedy and hope of their circumstances. "Take care of my boy, Sergeant," Weber said simply. "You have my word," Grayson replied, and though they spoke different languages, no translation was necessary for this promise. The hours that followed proved challenging for both Grayson and Klaus. The boy alternated between periods of anxious silence and bursts of questions that Grayson struggled to answer with his limited German. They established a rudimentary communication system, combining the few German words Grayson knew, the English phrases Klaus had begun to learn, and a great deal of gesturing. To distract Klaus from his worry, Grayson enlisted his help with various tasks around camp, carrying messages to the mess tent, helping sort medical supplies, and eventually joining a game of catch with several off-duty soldiers who quickly warmed to the earnest German child. Private Cooper fashioned a makeshift ball from wrapped cloth, and soon Klaus was laughing as he ran between the American soldiers, temporarily forgetting the gravity of the day's events. Watching him, Grayson was reminded of the resilience of children, their capacity to find moments of joy, even amid extraordinary circumstances. Around midday, Grayson took Klaus to the mess tent for lunch. As they sat together, Klaus suddenly looked up from his food and asked a question. "Nach Hause gehen? Home go?" Grayson understood enough to recognize the question, but not enough to provide a satisfactory answer. He motioned for one of the German-speaking radio operators to join them. "He's asking when he can go home," the operator translated, after listening to Klaus's expanded question. Grayson considered his response carefully. "Tell him that right now his home is damaged and not safe, but that when the fighting is completely over, people will help rebuild it, and maybe then he and his father can return." When this was translated, Klaus nodded seriously, then asked another question. "He wants to know if his mother and sister will be able to find them," the radio operator explained. This question was even more difficult to answer honestly. With Germany fractured and millions displaced, family reunifications were complex and often heartbreaking processes. "Tell him that the American army helps people find their families," Grayson said, choosing hope over brutal honesty, and that his father will know the best way to look for them when he returns. Klaus seemed to accept this answer, though his expression suggested he understood more about the uncertainties ahead than an 8-year-old should have to comprehend. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Klaus grew increasingly anxious about his father's absence. Grayson tried to explain that such operations took time, the distance to travel, the number of men to process, the paperwork involved, but the boy's worry was palpable. To divert his attention, Grayson retrieved his field journal and some colored pencils borrowed from the company clerk. He demonstrated drawing simple shapes and figures, encouraging Klaus to do the same. Soon, the boy was absorbed in creating a detailed picture of what Grayson recognized as the village of Waldenhof, complete with its clock tower, baker's shop, and forest backdrop. When Klaus pointed to a house with a small workshop attached and said, "Unser Haus," our house, Grayson nodded appreciatively. "Beautiful," he said, pointing to the drawing. "Schön." Klaus smiled briefly, then added 2 figures to the scene, a woman and a girl standing beside the house. His mother and sister, Grayson realized, the family made whole again on paper, if not yet in reality. As twilight approached, and there was still no sign of the convoy's return, Grayson began to worry. The surrender point was only 15 kilometers away. Even accounting for the complexities of processing hundreds of prisoners, they should have received word by now. His concern must have shown on his face because Klaus suddenly asked, "Mein Vater?" Before Grayson could formulate a reassuring response, the distant sound of vehicle engines reached them. Both turned toward the camp entrance as headlights appeared on the forest road. The convoy returned much larger than it had departed, a long line of vehicles carrying not just the American personnel, but also dozens of German officers who would help facilitate the surrender of remaining units in adjacent sectors. Intelligence had been correct about the collapsing command structure. Once Major Weber's surrender became known, other local commanders had quickly followed suit. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's jeep led the procession, and beside him sat Major Weber, looking exhausted but resolute. The moment the vehicle stopped, Klaus broke away from Grayson and ran toward his father, who descended from the jeep and caught his son in a tight embrace. Grayson approached more slowly, exchanging salutes with Colonel Harrison. "Successful operation, sir?" he inquired. Harrison nodded, a rare smile crossing his weathered features. "Beyond our expectations, Sergeant. 378 men as promised, plus their equipment and vehicles in good order. And," he gestured to the other German officers now being escorted to the command tent, "Major Weber convinced several neighboring unit commanders to join the surrender. We're looking at nearly 900 prisoners total, with potentially more to follow." "That's excellent news, sir." "Indeed. And Division is quite pleased. This significantly reduces the resistance we expected to face in the mountain passes." Harrison's expression turned more somber. "We also discovered something disturbing. Major Weber's unit had been ordered to destroy several bridges and mountain tunnels as part of a scorched earth policy, infrastructure that would have taken years to rebuild and significantly hampered civilian recovery after the conflict." "And now that won't happen," Grayson observed. "Precisely." Harrison glanced toward Weber, who was now introducing his son to Captain Lehman. The Major proved quite forthcoming with intelligence. His cooperation will likely save many lives on both sides. As Harrison moved on to supervise the processing of the senior German officers, Grayson approached Weber and Klaus. The German Major straightened and extended his hand, which Grayson shook firmly. "Thank you for watching over my son, Sergeant Grayson," Weber said through Lieutenant Schneider, who had rejoined them. "He was no trouble," Grayson replied with a smile for Klaus. "Quite the artist, actually." Weber placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We have much to discuss, you and I," he told Grayson, "but it will need to wait. I must help your officers with the processing of my men." "I understand." Weber hesitated, then asked, "What will happen to Klaus while I am being processed?" It was a fair question. Standard procedure would separate prisoners from civilians, even family members. "With your permission," Grayson said after a moment's thought, "I'd like to request that Klaus remain under my supervision for now. I'll ensure he's well cared for until arrangements can be made." When Schneider translated this, Weber's relief was evident. You have my deepest gratitude, Sergeant. As Weber departed with Lieutenant Schneider and several military police officers, Klaus looked up at Grayson questioningly. Your father needs to help our officers, Grayson explained slowly, using gestures to supplement his limited German. He will come back soon. Until then, you stay with me. Whether Klaus fully understood the words or simply trusted Grayson's tone, he nodded and remained close to the American sergeant as they watched the organized chaos of the surrender processing unfold around them. The following days established a new routine. Major Weber spent most daylight hours working with American intelligence officers, providing detailed information about German defensive positions, supply caches, and unit dispositions throughout the region. His cooperation, along with that of other surrendered officers, was instrumental in facilitating additional surrenders and avoiding unnecessary combat in the war's final days. During these periods, Klaus remained with Grayson, who had been temporarily assigned to base camp operations, while his squad continued reconnaissance missions. The arrangement proved beneficial for everyone involved. Weber could focus on his debriefings, knowing his son was safe. Klaus had a consistent caretaker during a profoundly disruptive time, and Grayson found unexpected fulfillment in helping the boy navigate his new circumstances. Lieutenant Schneider developed a simple English-German vocabulary list for Klaus, who proved to be a quick study. Within days, he could communicate basic needs and ideas, proudly demonstrating his growing skills whenever his father was present. "Water, please," he would say carefully, or "I am hungry," phrases that never failed to bring a proud smile to Weber's face, despite their circumstances. On April 25th, 3 days after the surrender, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison summoned Grayson to the command tent. Inside, he found the colonel with Captain Miller and a civilian affairs officer who had arrived that morning. "Sergeant Grayson," Harrison began, "we've received new orders regarding our German prisoners. Major Weber and the other officers are to be transferred to a processing center near Frankfurt tomorrow morning." Grayson nodded, having expected this development. "And Klaus, sir?" "That's why we called you here," the civilian affairs officer interjected. "Standard procedure would place the boy in a displaced persons camp until family reunification can be attempted. However, given the unusual circumstances and Major Weber's ongoing cooperation, we're exploring alternatives." "What sort of alternatives?" Grayson asked. Harrison exchanged glances with Miller before continuing. "Major Weber has made a formal request that his son remain in American care rather than being placed in a general refugee facility. Specifically, he's requested that you continue as Klaus's guardian until family reunification becomes possible." Grayson was momentarily speechless. "Me, sir? I'm due to rotate with my unit. We're supposed to move eastward next week." "Plans change, Sergeant," Miller replied. "Your linguistic skills, limited as they are, combined with your background as an educator, make you uniquely qualified for this assignment. With all due respect, sir, I'm a combat infantryman, not a child welfare specialist." The civilian affairs officer, a former social worker named Johnson, leaned forward. "That's where I come in, Sergeant. I'll be overseeing the case officially, but we need someone the boy trusts for day-to-day care. You've established that trust." Grayson considered this unexpected proposal. What about Major Weber? What are his thoughts beyond the formal request? "Perhaps you should ask him yourself," Harrison suggested, nodding toward the tent entrance where Weber now stood with Lieutenant Schneider. The German officer entered at Harrison's invitation, his bearing formal despite his prisoner status. Through Schneider's translation, he addressed Grayson directly. "Sergeant Grayson, I understand this is an unusual request, perhaps even an imposition, but these are unusual times." Weber's composed exterior briefly faltered. "I will likely be held for an extended period. The processing centers are no place for a child, and the refugee camps are overcrowded and poorly equipped for a boy his age." Weber continued, his voice growing more earnest. "When I surrendered, I did so not only to save my men, but to secure a future for my son. If he remains with you, even temporarily, I know he will be treated with kindness and respect. You have proven that already." Grayson listened carefully, understanding the gravity of what was being asked. What about his mother and sister? Shouldn't we prioritize reuniting them? Weber's expression darkened. My wife and daughter were heading to relatives in Dresden when they evacuated. He didn't need to elaborate. Everyone present knew what had happened to Dresden in February. We have no confirmation of their fate, Weber continued. I have provided all known information to your intelligence officers, and they have promised to make inquiries through the Red Cross, but this process may take months, even years. The tent fell silent as Grayson contemplated the responsibility being offered to him. Finally, he asked, "Have you discussed this with Klaus? What does he want?" When Schneider translated this question, Weber smiled slightly. "My son admires you greatly, Sergeant. When I suggested this possibility, his only question was whether you would teach him more English." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Grayson couldn't help but return the smile. "I'd like to speak with Klaus before making a decision." "Of course," Colonel Harrison agreed. "Take the day to consider, Sergeant. We'll need your answer by tomorrow morning when the transport leaves." That afternoon, Grayson took Klaus for a walk along the camp perimeter, Lieutenant Schneider accompanying them to facilitate communication. The boy seemed to sense the importance of the conversation, listening intently as Grayson explained through Schneider that his father would be leaving the next day. "Where is he going?" Klaus asked, his voice small but steady. Grayson chose his words carefully. "To another American camp, where he'll be safe until the conflict is completely over." "Can I go with him?" "I'm afraid not," Grayson replied gently. "But your father has asked if you would like to stay with me for a while instead." Klaus considered this solemnly. "Until we find Mother and Lena." "Yes," Grayson confirmed, surprised by the boy's pragmatism. "And then we'll figure out what happens next, together." After a long moment, Klaus nodded. "Vater says you are a good man. He says you were a teacher before you were a soldier." "That's right. I taught history to students not much older than you." Klaus brightened slightly at this. "Will you teach me? English and history?" "I would be honored to," Grayson replied, feeling a sudden certainty about his decision. "And perhaps you can teach me more German." The following morning brought clear skies and a solemn atmosphere as the transport convoy prepared to depart with Major Weber and the other German officers. Grayson and Klaus stood nearby, watching as the prisoners were loaded into trucks under the watchful eyes of military police. Before boarding, Weber was permitted a final moment with his son. He knelt to Klaus's level, speaking softly in German, his words for his child alone. Klaus nodded several times, his small face set in a determined expression that mirrored his father's. Finally, Weber rose and extended his hand to Grayson. "I entrust you with my greatest treasure, Sergeant," he said formally through Schneider's translation. "When we meet again, may it be in more peaceful times." Grayson shook the offered hand firmly. "I give you my word that I'll protect him as if he were my own." As Weber boarded the transport truck, he turned for one last look at his son. Klaus raised his hand in a small wave, and his father responded in kind. A simple gesture that conveyed volumes about the bond between them and the hope that their separation would not be permanent. Once the convoy had disappeared from view, Klaus remained staring down the road, his shoulders set with the same military bearing his father had displayed. "Would you like some breakfast?" Grayson asked gently, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Klaus looked up, his expression shifting from stoic to vulnerable in an instant. "Is my father going to be all right?" Through Schneider's translation, Grayson assured him, "Your father is a respected officer who surrendered honorably. He'll be treated well." This seemed to satisfy Klaus, who nodded and took Grayson's offered hand as they walked back toward the mess tent. Over the following weeks, as spring blossomed fully across the German countryside, an unusual partnership formed between the American sergeant and the German boy. Grayson was reassigned to a civil affairs attachment, which allowed him to remain at a rear echelon base while maintaining guardianship of Klaus. Together with Lieutenant Schneider and the civilian specialist Johnson, they established a care plan that balanced Klaus's immediate needs with longer-term considerations. Each morning began with English lessons, using materials provided by the Army's Education Corps. Klaus proved an eager student, his vocabulary expanding rapidly. In the afternoons, Grayson would take him to assist with simple tasks around the base, helping in the mess tent, sorting mail, or organizing supplies, activities that gave the boy purpose and integrated him into the daily rhythms of camp life. In the evenings, they would work together on letters to various refugee centers and Red Cross offices, seeking information about Klaus's mother and sister. Though these inquiries initially yielded no results, the process itself seemed therapeutic for Klaus, offering a channel for his worry and a sense of active participation in the search for his family. As news of Germany's formal surrender on May 8th reached their base, Grayson watched Klaus's reaction carefully. The boy received the information with a mixture of relief and uncertainty, understanding that while the fighting had ended, the future remained unpredictable. "What happens now?" Klaus asked that evening as they sat outside their quarters, watching the celebratory but restrained activities around the camp. "Now the rebuilding begins," Grayson replied, having grown adept enough in German to hold basic conversations without a translator. "It will take time, but things will get better." Klaus nodded thoughtfully. "And my father." "The processing will go faster now that the fighting has stopped," Grayson assured him. "We should receive news of him soon." That prediction proved accurate. In early June, official notification arrived that Major Friedrich Weber had been classified as a Category 3 prisoner, one who had surrendered voluntarily and demonstrated cooperation, resulting in less restrictive conditions and the possibility of earlier release for reconstruction work. More surprising was the letter that accompanied this notification, a personal note from Weber to his son, approved by military censors. Grayson watched as Klaus read his father's words, the boy's expression shifting from concentration to cautious hope. "Vater says they are allowing him to help rebuild bridges," Klaus explained, looking up from the letter. "He says this is good because it means they trust him." "That is good news," Grayson agreed, genuinely pleased for both father and son. "And," Klaus continued, his voice gaining excitement, "he says there is news about Mother and Lena." This revelation caught Grayson's full attention. "What news?" They were not in Dresden when... Klaus's voice faltered, but he pressed on. The train was delayed and they never arrived there. Instead, they were directed to a different city farther south. The Red Cross found their names on a refugee register in Bavaria. Grayson felt a surge of relief and joy for the boy. "That's wonderful news, Klaus. It means they're alive and safe." Klaus nodded vigorously, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Vater says the Americans are helping arrange for us to be reunited, but it will take time." He looked up at Grayson, suddenly uncertain. "What will happen to me then?" Grayson placed a reassuring hand on Klaus's shoulder. "Then you'll be with your family again, as you should be." "But what about you?" Klaus persisted. "Will you go back to America?" "Eventually," Grayson acknowledged, "but not right away. There's still much work to be done here." Klaus fell silent for a moment, then asked with childlike directness, "Will you visit us when we have our house again?" Grayson smiled at the boy's assumption that everything would return to normal, a hope he couldn't bring himself to diminish. "I'd like that very much." In July, as summer heat settled over the region, orders came for Klaus to be transferred to a family reunification center in Bavaria, where his mother and sister had been located. Though Grayson had expected and prepared for this moment, the reality of saying goodbye proved more difficult than anticipated. The evening before Klaus's departure, they sat together reviewing a small album of photographs and drawings they had collected over their months together, snapshots of a unique friendship forged amid the aftermath of conflict. "I have something for you," Grayson said, presenting Klaus with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a journal bound in simple leather with the boy's initials stamped on the cover, and beside it, a compass in a polished wooden case. "The journal is for your stories," Grayson explained, "and the compass is to find my way home," Klaus finished, running his fingers over the gleaming instrument. "And to remember which direction America is." Grayson smiled at the boy's intuitive understanding. "Exactly." Klaus reached into his own pocket and produced a small object, a wooden clock hand intricately carved in the Black Forest style. "From my father's workshop," he explained. "He would want you to have it." Grayson accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, recognizing its significance. "I'll treasure it always." The following morning brought overcast skies as a jeep arrived to transport Klaus to the reunification center. Lieutenant Schneider, who had become a friend to both of them, would accompany the boy on his journey, ensuring his safe arrival. As they loaded Klaus's few belongings, Grayson knelt to the boy's level. "Remember what we practiced." Klaus straightened his shoulders and extended his hand formally. "Thank you for everything, Sergeant Grayson," he said in careful English. "I will never forget you." Grayson shook the offered hand, then pulled the boy into a tight embrace. "Nor I you, Klaus Weber." As the jeep pulled away, Klaus waved until he was out of sight, leaving Grayson with a mixture of loss and fulfillment. What had begun as a chance encounter amid the ruins of war had evolved into something profound, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion could build bridges across seemingly insurmountable divides. 2 months later, Sergeant Thomas Grayson received a letter forwarded through military channels. Inside was a photograph of the Weber family: Friedrich, his wife Maria, daughter Lena, and Klaus, standing together outside a simple building that served as temporary housing for displaced families. They were thin but smiling, reunited against the odds in a world struggling to rebuild. On the back of the photograph, in careful English, Klaus had written, "The war is over, we are learning to live again. Thank you for showing us how." In that moment, Sergeant Grayson understood that sometimes the most significant victories are not marked by advancing front lines or captured territory, but by the reclamation of humanity in places where it seemed lost forever. The clock hand from Friedrich Weber's workshop remained with Thomas Grayson through his return to America, through his resumption of teaching, through marriage and children and grandchildren. It sat on his desk as he taught generations of students about the complexity of conflict and the power of individual choices to change the course of history. And in a small German town, rebuilt from the ruins, a compass in a wooden case held a place of honor in the workshop of a master clockmaker named Klaus Weber, who never forgot the American sergeant who had found him in the rubble and shown him that even among enemies, humanity endures. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.